Welcome to this very special event this evening with two of our most favourite writers and thinkers about science and the environment, Elizabeth Kolbert and David Wallace-Wells. And it is 5x15's great honour to be able to bring them together for this conversation. And I think it's the first conversation that they have had together. So we are really very lucky. Elizabeth Kolbert has been a staff writer at The New Yorker for over 20 years. And her book, The Sixth Extinction, was an international bestseller, which was a winner of the 2015 Pulitzer Prize and was hailed by everyone from Barack Obama to Al Gore to Bill Gates. And it was really a talismanic book for people who were concerned about the environment and the fate of our planet. And now we're very glad that she's back with a new book, which is called Under a White Sky, and which we are here to hear about and discuss further this evening. It's an urgent exploration of humanity's impact on nature and the world around us. And it's an exploration into the scientific discoveries and innovations that could help us still to avert disaster and to reverse some of the damage that we've already done. It's out this week in the UK and available from all good bookshops, including, of course, our book partner, Newham Books, and we hope that you will all order a copy. And interviewing tonight, we have David Wallace-Wells. He's editor-at-large of New York Magazine, and he writes about climate change and the future of technology and science. And he is, of course, the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, which was a hugely influential book in 2019, selected by all the newspapers as Book of the Year. And it was a wake-up call around the world. So we're very lucky to have them. We have 300 people already on the webinar, and I think more will be joining us. You can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and David's going to try to bring in as many as he can towards the end of our session. We've got an hour. So for now, I will hand over to David and say welcome. Thank you very, very much for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you, Daisy, and thank you all for coming. It's a privilege to be doing this in front of you. And Betsy, it's especially a privilege to be talking with you in public. I should say this isn't the first time we've talked, it's just the first time we're talking in public, but really excited to be having the conversation. And I think it would be useful to start picking up off of Daisy's introduction of you, which sort of stood on top of the masterpiece, The Sixth Extinction, to introduce this book. And to ask you sort of briefly, in part to orient everyone in the audience who might not have read the book yet, how this book proceeds from that one and to what degree it represents a disjuncture in your thinking, but how the story of that book, which is about the large scale die-off of so many of the planet's species, relates to this one, which is largely about what we're doing in response to that and maybe exacerbating it along the way. How do you see the two works fitting together?
Well, before I launch into that, I also want to just thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank you for being here, David, because David has a brand new baby, which everyone knows is kind of a big deal, and so I'm going to try to not make this my usual, unbelievable downer. How's that, for the sake of the new baby? So this book, it did follow pretty, pretty logically in my own mind. I don't know about other people's minds. From after I wrote The Sixth Extinction, the question was sort of, okay, what now, and what is the world going to do in response to this extraordinary set of changes that we've set in motion, the results of which are pretty evidently, in many cases, to the detriment of other species, and increasingly, obviously, to the detriment of humanity. So what happens next? And I started to just, being a journalist, as you know, looking for stories that might elucidate some aspect of this. I actually went, sort of the first story that set this project in motion is in the middle of the book. I went to Hawaii to talk to some scientists, in fact, a British scientist who was working in Hawaii by the name of Ruth Gates, who's a really dynamic, charismatic woman who had started this project that had been dubbed the Supercoral Project. And the idea behind the Supercoral Project was, we have radically altered the oceans. The oceans are warming. They're warming really fast. And a lot of the CO2 that we pour in the atmosphere, it goes straight into the oceans, basically, and it is changing the pH of the water in the oceans. And one group of organisms that does not like these changes is reef building corals. So Ruth's idea was, okay, if we want reefs in the future, we've already so altered the oceans, we're going to have to alter reef building corals, which are these tiny gelatinous little animals that build these amazing structures called reefs. So this project was designed to sort of hybridize or somehow breed up corals that were going to be more resilient to warmer ocean temperatures. It's still continuing. And very tragically, Ruth died a couple of years into the project, though the project continues. And as I said, she was very dynamic and she was very smart, and she sort of got me thinking, well, what is the future of, you would consider a reef a completely natural ecosystem to the extent that they still exist, and yet they weren't going to survive without human intervention, was sort of her point. And that idea of intervening again to correct for previous interventions got me thinking, and I started to sort of notice this pattern, and that's sort of how the book, how in my mind the book came to be.
So one way of thinking then about the project that you engaged in is as a work of sort of present tense contemporary reportage in which you visit and speak with and document a lot of human interventions, some large scale, some quite small scale, but in all ways quite dramatic, that are essentially aiming to restore or rebalance or stabilize environmental systems that have been cast into disarray, largely by, if not exclusively by human action in the recent past. But I think there's something really interesting in what you just said, in what you just repeated from Ruth Gates, in that she offered you a lesson, not just how to think about the present and the possible future, but also on how to think about the past. She said, a reef, you think of a reef as a truly natural ecosystem. But one of the things that I found so memorable in the book were the threads in which you were documenting the development of the idea of nature through time as evolving in contrast to its own despoilation. Like, we think now we're living on the precipice of environmental disaster, nature is disappearing, or it's being destroyed, or it's destroying us, choose your metaphor. But we think of it as this sort of intuitive binary system. There is nature and there is humanity or industrial, capitalism, or however you want to think of it. And one of the things I found most interesting was the way in which in your book you sort of sketched a deeper history of these ideas and showed that nature has really only ever been a term that we took seriously and valued as we understood it was under threat. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that historical perspective informs your own perspective in thinking about these challenges, and maybe the two neat binary patterns that we find ourselves falling into when we think about intervening in the way that all of your subjects are.
Well, sure. I mean, the history of the concept of nature obviously is a long and complicated one, and I should also say that, it's inevitably, the discussion in the book is inevitably somewhat Eurocentric, and I'm sure that there are a lot of people who would say, a lot of cultures on planet Earth, a lot of cultures obviously we no longer have access to what their views were, but to the extent that we do, they would not have the same sort of European Western views of nature that we do, which were sort of inherited, from the Romantics. But this idea of nature, why would you even have an idea of nature except at the point, right, where you are starting to see humanity separating from nature? So I think a lot of our concepts, and once again, these are not like original ideas, people have written, many volumes on this, that we are inheritors of this view that nature is something apart from us. In wilderness, as Thoreau said, as wilderness lies the salvation of the world. Now, by the time Thoreau wrote Walden, Boston and Walden Pond was already being completely deforested for the railroad, and he was very, very aware of that, but doesn't really intrude in the book very much. But those are the ideas of nature that we all now have to sort of grapple with. What are we talking about when we talk about nature, which is now we're completely implicated in it, right? When you change the climate of the globe, can you really, the end of nature, Bill McKibben's End of Nature, that's 30 years old already. Can you really speak of a nature that exists apart from humanity? Now, the problem is, or the complexity is, there's still most of the world, or half the world, is not human created. This is a very interesting statistic that just recently came out in a big paper in Nature, that if you take the weight of all of the human-made materials on Earth, and that includes, I should say, gravel, so depending on how you want to classify gravel, but if you take the weight of all the human-manipulated or made materials, sometime around 2020, that weight equaled the weight of all the biomass on Earth, okay? So this is the kind of situation we're in, where now everything that we have fabricated in some way, or at least dug up out of the earth, has the weight of all the biomass on Earth. And that is the sort of weird juncture that we're in, where we're involved in everything, but of course we don't control it. We are just enmeshed in it in ways that we can't really get out of.
That sort of sounds like a tipping point. Like we reached a balance, and then presumably we imagine the future is going to become more dramatic. That the balance will tip, and the human side of the equation, or human created side of the equation, will be heavier.
I think that's a safe bet.
Yeah. How do you see the scale of changes that we're likely to be experiencing over the next few decades? Like when you think about, if the book is about people who are trying to solve it in local or focused ways, the really large problem of this tumult, what is the scale of that tumult? Like how much change will we have to reckon with or adapt to? How different will the world be, and how much more will it require of us to live comfortably on it than, say, we might have expected a few decades ago? Like how, categorically, how should we be thinking? How do you think about just what scale of a challenge this project of learning to live in this new world as it continues to change? How big a project is that?
Well, it's immense. I mean, that is the problem, that you keep bumping up to the scale of the problem, because the scale of the problem is equivalent to the scale of the effort that we've put into this project of changing the planet, And so if you even if you say, well, this world-changing project, which often goes by the shorthand, the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene, as I've heard it pronounced in England, even if you say it's only dates from the post-war period, from 1950, let's say, so we've only been at it for 70%, for 70 years, as you yourself have so, eloquently written, we've poured half of the CO2 in history into the atmosphere just in the last 30 years, so we are really ramping up our impacts really fast. And if you wanted to deal with the scale of the carbon problem, this is, sort of the fundamental question, I suppose. So if you want to decarbonize the economy, for example, just to take that as one example, that effort has to be on the scale of all of the carbon infrastructure that's been built, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So it's always scale that.
And that's just the decarbonization project,
Exactly.
Not even the adaptation part of it. Yeah.
Exactly. So the scale is what keeps. So there's a chapter in the book. To give a concrete example, I went to visit some of my carbon emissions in Iceland, where a company that has machines that do direct air capture. They literally suck CO2 out of the air. They just take ambient air, they take the CO2 out of it. If you stand, behind these machines, it's like standing in a, sort of pre-industrial atmosphere. And then they take this carbon and they shove it very deep underground in Iceland where there's a lot, where it's just completely volcanic rock, it reacts, it mineralizes. It's a very cool process, okay? And you think to yourself, well, that is cool, let's start getting CO2 out of the air. And then you think of the scale at which that would have to be accomplished. We've, poured roughly 2 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So to get that back out, you need to do, you need to do 2 trillion tons in the reverse direction. And you need, once again, an infrastructure on the scale of the fossil fuel infrastructure we have right now. So scale is what always, with every single one of these, or I shouldn't say every single one, but almost all of these problems and potential solutions, fixes, is the issue. Scale has got to be commensurate with the problem, and the problem is the size of the Earth.
I was just reading, there's a recent report I was reading about direct air capture, and in which they estimated that just to, sort of solve for the hardest to decarbonize emissions, the vast majority of things, we have a pretty good idea of how we can get rid of them. There's a problem of politics, a problem of deployment, but we sort of have the know-how. But there's a sliver where we don't know anymore. We don't know yet how to do that. And to just do a direct air capture to sort of, solve for those emissions, they estimated would require a third of today's global energy use. And then if you imagine you building into that equation all of the delay, all of the, the slow movement that we've done on decarbonization and all the sectors that we know how to decarbonize, it just makes the project grow and grow and grow and grow. And, I think my own sense is, as you write in the book, some of this is going to have to happen. We're going to have to figure out some ways of doing it, but it is still just terrifyingly large as a project, and thinking about, and because it's so large, therefore will quite profoundly shape the experience of the people on the planet over the next decades, even if we get it right.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just gonna, we talked about this a few weeks ago when we were talking about your book, but to me, the sort of central idea, to the extent that there is a sort of an idea thrust in the book, and that you're a very careful journalist who doesn't do that all that explicitly, unlike me. But it's when you say that, we're sort of past the point. I don't have the book in front of me, but we're sort of past the point in which we can entertain ideas of returning to the past that we're hoping to preserve. And we're now at a point when, if there's going to be a solution to the problem of control, it's going to be more control, more interventions of the kind that you're documenting in the book. And that made me think of the sort of famous Stuart Brand line, what is it, like, we are as gods, we might as well get good at it. And I wondered, if there's a solution to control, it's going to be more control. We are as gods, we might as well get good at it. In some level, those contain the same idea, and in other ways, they suggest a very different sort of temperamental perspective on the project of these kinds of interventions. And I wonder, just sort of explicitly, like, do you think we can get good at this? Like, do you think we are capable of large-scale interventions to stabilize and secure at least the aspects of the planet's systems that we depend on and expect to depend on going forward? What does success look like, and like, how will we know if we're doing well?
Well, I mean, honestly, that's the question at the center of the book. I mean, Stuart Brand started out back in the 60s saying, we are as gods and we might as well get good at it. And he's recently said, we are as gods and we have to get good at it. And many people have responded to that. I quote Ed Wilson, who says, we're not gods, we're basically Stone Age humans, just walking around with these incredible technologies. And Paul Kingsnorth, who's a very interesting writer, I think, who says, we are as gods and we're really, really bad at it. We're the gods of destruction. And I think that question, and I do want to say that the quote from the book, if there's going to be an answer, that's a big if. But I think it's our predilection. That's where we look for solutions, and that's where we're going to increasingly look for solutions, because we don't have a lot of great options. And the option of turning around, which I think is very attractive and emotionally is what I personally am drawn to as a child of the 70s, is not really viable. And that was sort of Ruth Gates' point, to go back to, Ruth, look, people want to go back to the reefs of the past, as if we just stop doing what we're doing, reefs will come back. And this really sad and tragic truth is, the oceans are going to continue to warm up really for centuries now. That's been set kind of in motion, and there's no getting that heat out without really radical interventions, which we could talk about, or not another set of really radical interventions, to cool the planet down. And so we're just in a jam. We're in a terrible jam, and we can, I think there's a big movement, should we put it, Joe Biden has talked about putting aside 30% of the US by 2030. Can we just put parts of the earth aside for other creatures? I think that is the closest we could get to sort of preserving things. They won't be the same because the climate will have changed and all the species that were in one place are going to move to another. But if you want to try to get as many creatures through the period that we're in, through this century, through the next couple of centuries, that would be the closest I can think of, or anyone I think has thought of, to do that. Everything else requires, human beings thinking this through and trying to impose on this tangle of human and man-made, this combined human and natural system, which is now the entirety of planet Earth, trying to think through some solution and impose it on what is not a logical system, what is not a system that was brought together logically. It was a system that evolved over, billions of years.
Yeah, and there are problems even with the sort of the ideal approach that you're talking about, setting aside huge chunks of the planet. I was recently reading a paper suggesting that, many of the world's forests could turn from what are called carbon sinks, which absorb carbon, to carbon sources, which produce it as soon as in the next couple of decades, which is just one small indication, although it's in a certain way kind of overwhelming, of how little we can rely on the natural systems that we imagine in our head to continue in the way that we imagine they will continue in the absence of human intervention. That the disruption is so large scale and complicated that, even if we did, say, set aside 30% of the Earth's surface, or even 50% of the Earth's surface, those ecosystems are not going to be the same ones that were around in the 17th century. And the forest one in particular really stuck with me, just because I think, especially for someone like me, who's a lifelong urbanite who doesn't have so much direct experience with nature, I still think of the forest as this sort of like idyllic and iconic place of retreat from the Anthropocene into a place of deep time and kind of natural harmony. And it strikes me as really not just scary, but disorienting to think that within my own lifetime, it may be the case that those systems are wreaking more havoc on the Earth's climate than they are even helping in its solution. And the way that destabilizes our relationship to the natural world, I think is very much an open question, which is another thing that you're exploring in the book, in talking about people who are thinking in more creative ways about and beyond the sort of simple binary, and trying to make a difference in their own fields, in their own ways. So I always bristle when people ask me questions about optimism and pessimism, and I say climate change is not a matter of mood affiliation. It's like whether I'm feeling happy one day or sad the next day doesn't change the actual trajectory of the story. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit, as a way of sort of illustrating a few more particular anecdotes and stories from your book, as you've been doing this reporting, what were some of the things that you found most eye-opening and encouraging? And what were some of the things that you found most distressing or discouraging in thinking about, the big question, whether we can get good enough at this to really stabilize and secure a relatively happy future for ourselves?
Well, one, the sort of center of the book, at the center of the book is this extraordinary new capacity that we've just developed over the last couple of decades, but that has really been taken to a new level just in the last decade, which is gene editing. So gene editing, for the book, to tell a gene editing story, I actually ordered a gene editing kit. You can order from a company in California, which provides you with the wherewithal to gene edit some bacteria in your own kitchen. And I believe I actually did gene edit some bacteria to be antibiotic resistant, which was pretty extraordinary when you think about it, because I know nothing about gene editing. Now, also for the book, I went to visit some people who do know a lot about gene editing, and we're using this newfound suite of techniques that just go by the acronym CRISPR to gene edit cane toads in Australia. So cane toads are this, extraordinary invasive species in Australia. They were brought, supposedly they were going to help with the beetles that were eating the sugarcane crop in the 1930s. They went crazy. They had no predators. They have taken over coastal Australia, basically, though they are still increasing their territory every year. And the problem is in addition to just being huge and voracious eaters, they're highly toxic. So Australia's native wildlife chomps on them and dies. And so do people's puppies. And so on occasion do people, but very rarely. So they were trying to gene edit these cane toads just as a sort of exercise to be less toxic. And they had succeeded in creating, I saw some cane toads that were less toxic. And in theory, if you put them out into the countryside, they bred with other toads, you should also potentially, in theory again, you could gene edit them with something called a gene drive, so that you would push this trait out into the population and all toads eventually would have it, once again, in theory. Now, how you feel about that, how you feel about our now using CRISPR, for example, to try to deal with problems that we ourselves have created, messing around with life at its most intimate level, in the level of the genome, I think is going to be a huge issue going forward, because there are many potential problems that could be solved. And here's another example I will give. I went to visit some chestnut trees, American chestnut trees, that have been gene edited. They have a one gene tweak. And so they're resistant to chestnut blight, which was a pathogen brought to the US from Asia in the early part of the 20th century, killed every single chestnut tree, basically in America, 4 billion trees. So where I live in New England, you would have found like every fourth tree was a chestnut. Now there are 0. So this tweaked tree is resistant to the blight. It's sitting in fenced-in plots because it's not allowed out yet, although that permitting process is happening even as we speak, and so maybe it will be allowed out. How do people feel about that? Would we rather have genetically tweaked chestnuts, or would we rather have no chestnuts? And this question, I think, is going to keep coming up. We're going to keep being faced with that choice. Do we go forward here with some of these technologies that we consider intrinsically very nervous making and even maybe anathema, or do we say, when that's potentially the only choice to save certain species, and as I say, increasing numbers of species? And I think that's going to be huge. Now, do I find that hopeful? If given the opportunity, I would plant one of these chestnut trees in my backyard. How's that? Now, does that give me hope, or does that say, well, that's just a small, stay against the oblivion of the American chestnut tree? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure how I feel about, gene editing everything from here on in. But I think that's an interesting question that really, brings home these very difficult choices that we're confronted with.
Yeah, it was interesting. You started at the end you said how you felt, but you actually opened your discussion by saying, how do people feel about that?
Well, I mean, I quote one scientist in the book who's talking about solar geoengineering, which we can talk about, and he says, we don't get to decide. Scientists don't get to decide, and journalists don't get to decide either. And it's maybe a bit of a cop out to say, well, I don't get to decide, therefore I don't need to decide. But these are big public policy questions that are going to be answered or not answered. A lot of them are just being not answered because we're going on and we're too busy worrying about other things. But one day when we turn our attention to them, they will have to be answered either through, incredibly complicated and global negotiations, or by someone just doing something, someone just releasing something, for example, a gene-edited organism, a gene-drive organism out into the world that then either successfully solves a problem or, wreaks total havoc.
You were just touching on a little bit like your role as a journalist, how you see yourself, and how that lines up or doesn't line up with the sort of moral complexities and I don't know exactly how to put it, but it's not like you're in charge of making this decision anyway. And I wondered if you could talk just for a minute a little bit about how you see that, a little more about how you see your own role. When I think of you, I think obviously you're sort of brilliant, really consequential, towering above everyone else in our field of your generation. But you're also in this line at the New Yorker that goes back to Bill McKibben and goes back to Rachel Carson, both of whom were writing about some of these same issues in much more direct, exhortative ways. And you have found your path and your voice as more of a traditional journalistic storyteller, I would say. Your books have some clear meaning, and certainly many people have read The Sixth Extinction and felt the real impact of being sort of pummeled by the facts that it contains and the future that it sort of foretells. But you're not doing that punching so directly. You're letting the stories tell themselves. And I wonder how you think about that, especially in a time when nature writing is no longer like the province of dilettantes. It is like an unbelievably urgent political and moral question. And why do you write about these issues in the way that you do? How do you think about your own role? And to the extent that this book is, which I think it is to some degree, a somewhat more explicit statement of principles, especially on geoengineering, which we can talk about in a minute. Are you feeling yourself evolving, or am I wrong in reading that? How do you see it?
No, I think that the more you travel down this path of sort of, and I'm sure that you have had, well, I don't want to speak for you. I'll turn the question around at the end of this. But, the less you see, I would be honestly, well, I'll say two things. First of all, it's simply, it gets to a matter of taste in a way. I think, there are a lot of polemics around, and a good polemic is a great thing. And I really, enjoy a good polemic as much as the next person. But I do think that one of the things that I was certainly trying to do with The Sixth Extinction and am also trying to do with this book is get around, I think people are, defended against polemics to a certain extent. And I know this sounds very odd, of course, given the heaviness of the topics we've just been talking about, but I really wanted this book, Under White Sky, to be fun. And for people to read it and say that was actually fun, even though, a lot of the topics are very heavy. And so
It's even funny.
Thank you. It's a dark comedy. We are in a dark comedy. It may have many tragic effects, but the basic structure is kind of darkly comic. I use a selection from The Cat in the Hat Comes Back. That's the situation. We're just a bunch of, living through a kind of bumblers. It just so happens that at stake is, the survival of the planet and our own survival. But that doesn't mean that a lot of it isn't pretty comical. So part of it is a matter of taste, and also part of it is is genuinely, the more the less clear the solutions are. They really are not clear, okay? I'm sure you can appreciate that more than just about anyone. What is the answer? What is the quote-unquote answer to climate change? Now, whichever direction you go in, let's say you even go in, well, let's just stop burning all fossil fuels now. That's a good idea. I'm totally behind that. But it does raise a lot of very serious global equity questions, right? After, the US and Europe, and to an increasing extent China, have, taken up all the space, as it were, in the atmosphere for CO2 emissions, can we now really turn around and say to the Indians, to the Africans, to the South Americans, you really can't burn any fossil fuels, and everyone has to be on board for this? And that is very hard to imagine. It's very hard to even imagine that that's going to happen. And even if developing countries were on board, it's very hard to imagine how petrostates are going to be on board, right? It's very hard to imagine how the Russians are going to be on board. So we're in a really big, jam up. So then if you say, well, okay, we're going to have to come up with some other answer, and be that carbon dioxide removal, which we've discussed, or be it even solar geoengineering, which seems like, on some level, the worst possible idea, except perhaps for all other ideas. So that is the complexity of the situation. And so I don't want to be, falsely modest here, but I genuinely don't know what the solutions are. So it would be kind of crazy for me to try to tell everyone else what they are. I am exploring what very smart people would tell you the only solutions are. How's that?
Yeah, well, I think it's useful. We'll probably go to questions from the audience in a minute, but I think it is useful to dwell for a couple minutes on solar geoengineering, because that is, in a certain way, like the rub of it. Like, nobody's going to object to tinkering with some corals to get them to live a little better in warmer water. There isn't moral hazard there. But a lot of people in the climate movement find even some of measures like the tree genetic engineering that you're describing, even that involves a bit of moral hazard, in that it's sort of telling us that it's all going to be okay and that we don't need to move as quickly as we thought we did in order to live comfortably in the future. But certainly when it comes to a large-scale intervention, quite dramatic, like solar geoengineering, there are a lot of folks who think it's dangerous to even be studying it, talking about it, floating it as a possibility, debating it, taking it seriously. And yet, as a result, I think we have a much narrower sense of what it would do to the planet than we would if we had been much more open about that. How do you balance in your own mind those considerations, and how did you think about that? Not just the moral hazard problem of solar geoengineering, but the moral hazard problem of being a journalist writing about solar geoengineering and balancing those considerations in writing about this. Because I think for a lot of your readers, this is you're writing on this subject is the first time that they've encountered this this project possibility, however you want to refer to it. And yeah, how do you think of it, and how did you want to shape the books, in particular the book's discussion of the subject?
Well, I should start by just explaining what solar geoengineering is.
I meant to say in there at some point. Please first say what it is.
Okay, so solar geoengineering is this idea that we've loaded the atmosphere up with carbon dioxide. As discussed, it's really hard to get it back out again. It's not like other pollutants. It tends, unfortunately, to hang around for a very long time. So once it's up there, it's going to continue to warm the Earth for a very long time. And if you wanted to do something to, fix climate change or solve climate change or reverse climate change, all these words that are used, there's really nothing you can do in a human lifetime kind of timescale, except, in theory, counter one kind of intervention with another kind of intervention by throwing up some kind of reflective material. It could either be, sulfur dioxide is one thing that's mentioned calcium carbonate. Anyway, we don't need to talk about the details. You throw it up into the stratosphere using specially built planes, and it would create this stratospheric haze, which is what you get after volcanic eruptions, that would reflect sunlight back to space, and that would have a cooling effect, just as you get after major volcanic eruptions. You'd have to keep doing it because this stuff falls out of the stratosphere after a couple of years, so you'd have to keep injecting it into the stratosphere. Now, this raises, and this is purely theoretical, not a single test has been done, although we can get to the fact that people would like to run the first test before a test this summer, actually. And it sounds like the craziest possible idea, I think. And it probably is. And it has a huge, as you suggested, it has a huge moral hazard problem associated with it. And I think that what I wanted with the book, and it's the last chapter of the book, it's how the book gets its title, because one of the potential side effects of doing this would be to change the appearance of the sky, to make the sky whiter. And what I wanted to convey in the book was a sense of, sort of respectful horror. These are projects. The book sort of takes you along through projects that you might say, oh, that's okay, tinkering with corals, that's okay, tinkering with chestnut trees, that's okay, that's okay, that's okay. And then we get to this sort of the big one at the end. Is that okay? But everywhere along the way, there are really, really hard choices. And even with geoengineering, I think it is important to be honest about it and to say, we may have made such a mess of the world that maybe that is our best option. I mean, these are all questions somewhat above my pay grade, but which I do think people need to be thinking about. And one of the scientists that I quote, in the book, who says, if we don't talk about it, if we don't talk about it, there's not going to be, government research on this, military research on this even. If you think we can prevent that from happening, you're just being naive. And I think that's true. I think there's a certain naivete to that view.
Yeah, I mean, I know some people who've done work in this area who are sure that there are experiments already going on around the world that we just don't happen to know about. It seems somewhat logical that like Saudi Arabia may be trying to figure out how to buy some more time for their oil business,
Yes, I mean, a small scale, it's quite possible. I don't think anything very large scale. I mean, small scales have gone on already, very bad experiments, very inept experiments. But, look, we know, for example, and I don't want to make villains of the Chinese at all, but, we know that they're doing weather modification experiments, new generation of weather modification. Now, weather modification is not supposed to be allowed under UN treaty, and geoengineering should not be allowed under UN treaty. But, when the world is up against it, what are we going to do? That, I think, is that a moral hazard to raise that? I don't know. I think I would have taken that argument a lot more seriously 20 years ago. But even as, news about and climate change and the effects of climate change have become more and more apparent, once again, to go back to your great book, we just sat there and did, and dumped more and more CO2 into the air. So it's hard to see, a moral hazard has to have some resistance. I don't even see the resistance here,
So I think it should be, with 15 minutes left, we should move on to audience questions. And the first one comes from Rupert Reed. Hey, Rupert. He wrote this earlier on in the conversation. So he asked, hasn't nature also been a Janus-faced concept? Something that, other than human, emerges as a concept when it comes under threat, but nature has also for the longest time been a concept that includes humans. And he asks, doesn't it make sense for us to see nature as both including and excluding us? And maybe another way of putting that is, one lesson of the recent past is that nature, as we conceive of it, is a fiction which we have already left behind. but is it not more important for us to remember that even if we are leaving behind that natural world, we are still also a part of the natural world? Is that lesson not, might that lesson be both more important and maybe harder for at least people in places like the UK and the US to relearn?
No, I think that is really, and I mean, maybe climate change will deliver that message. I mean, if you're in the path of a, Category 5 hurricane, you realize that we are very, very much, at the mercy of nature. It may be nature that has been manipulated or influenced by humans, but it's still beyond our control. And I think that is, one of the interesting facts about the situation that we are in. We are imbricated in all of these systems, but we're not in control of them. And that's actually, the heart of the of the matter. If we could control the climate, we would be in a lot better shape. But we are just changing it without being in control of it. And, everything that we eat, everything, all the oxygen that we breathe, everything is a result of a biological system that we have also, once again, very heavily tried to put our thumb on that. Certainly agriculture is, one of the biggest changes to the earth that it's ever seen. But it's still, biology. So yes, absolutely. And you sometimes also get the pushback, well, humans are natural. Obviously, we're a product of, 3.5 billion years of evolution, just like everything else. So, if we decide to put sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere, isn't that just natural too? Now that at that point, it seems to me that it's the terminology that has broken down. Maybe we need, new terms. That seems to be, that at that point, the concept of nature seems to be somewhat meaningless. So I don't have a good answer for that, but definitely, I do think actually, precisely because many of us do live in parts of the world where nature, there's that great project, I'm sure you're aware of it, David, but many of our listeners are not, this Manhattan Project to, recreate Manhattan, New York before, the Dutch arrived. I think people were completely blown away by that, but it's like, what did they think? What did they think was here? It was sort of hilarious.
Yeah, just concrete streets with nobody walking.
Yeah, exactly. It's always been like that. Yeah.
So Rosie is asking about the risk, which we've talked a bit about moral hazard, but she's asking about a slightly different risk, the risk that if we rely on adaptation and some of these interventions that your book describes, not just that we put off the decarbonization that's necessary, but that we also perpetuate the inequalities that are being imposed on the world by climate change. Is there anything that you've worked on, reported on, seen that comes from the zone of sort of human intervention, but is aimed not just at restoring natural ecosystems and protecting species, but actually undoing some of the some of the structural inequalities of the sort of carbon economy that we live in?
Well, there are a lot of people, writing about this right now. It is a very active subject of conversation, I think, in the academic world, at least. For example, one way to take carbon out of the air, and many people would say the best way to do it is plant a lot of trees, right? And you plant a lot of trees, and you will suck up carbon as the trees grow. Trees, take up carbon as they grow. The problem is that when they die, they give that carbon up again. But in the time that a new forest is growing, it's taking up a lot of carbon. And so one question is, can people become basically carbon farmers? Is there a whole economy that could allow both, regeneration of forests and also allow transfer of wealth? You could pay people to do this. So that's one, avenue of one topic of discussion. But the very basic question that, the world is fundamentally, profoundly unequal, and some of us have contributed way, way, way more to the problem than others, and the others may well be the people to suffer first and foremost from the problems. I don't know that, to address that requires, well, on some level, there's no way to address that now because but the damage that's been done, to address it going forward, I think, is where we are driven to some of these radical solutions, honestly, because if you do want the developing world to be able to develop, how are you going to make space for that? And in fact, there's a book by a pretty famous American science fiction writer that's out just recently called The Ministry for the Future, which begins with India launching a round of geoengineering to protect its people. So you get pretty quickly, I think, into some pretty interesting possible geopolitical issues that don't necessarily fall along the lines that we sitting here tonight think they should fall. How's that?
Well, connected to that discussion is this question from Catherine, I hope I'm pronouncing her last name right, Budget Meakin. And she refers to Bill Gates' new book and says that, in his discussion of the path forward, he somewhat ducks out from the politics involved and, relies more on a sort of like, if I were in charge, this is how we could get there. I think my own sense is that that's hugely, hugely important, perhaps more important than a lot of the questions of technology and energy. And I wonder how you see that evolving. We have a different political consciousness about climate change now than we did a few years ago, in part because of a lot of the protest movements. And yet, things are moving, I think, much more slowly than most people who are pushing for action would be happy with. Where do you see the politics going? I guess there are a few different ways you could answer the question at the national level, at the geopolitical level, but how do we, this is not just a technological problem, it's not just a scientific problem, it's also in some very profound way a political one. And how can we think through those knotty problems and try to find some happy and helpful path forward?
Well, I mean, to give Bill Gates credit, I think what he was trying to do in that book is say, look, people are going to do, in the world that we currently live in, they're going to do what's cheapest and most convenient. And this is true at a grand scale, right? So, if you created energy systems that were genuinely cheaper than the fossil fuel infrastructure that we have right now, there would still be huge vested interests that would be, invested in maintaining the status quo, and that's a huge political problem. I'm in no way minimizing that political problem, but precisely, for example, for the developed world, I mean, for parts of the world which have no electricity right now, if you created an electrical system that was cheaper than, building a power plant that burned, natural gas or coal, that would be absolutely in the best interests of any, developing economy. And so that, I think, to give him credit, I think that is what he was pushing for, that these constant political battles, we've been having, we're about to have COP26, in the UK, and it's going to lead to exactly the same thing that every other COP has led to, which is, some progress on paper, but on the ground, we don't get the kind of progress that we need. Why don't we get the kind of progress that we need? Well, in part, it is, vast, entrenched interests. And in part, it is actually that this is actually hard. It's very hard to live the way we live and have almost 8 billion people live and many of whom would like a better standard of living than they have right now and deserve a better standard of living than they have right now. It's very hard to provide the energy for that society without fossil fuels. It's just very hard. So it's doable, but it's really, really hard. And I think that that is, I think that there are all sorts of levels of resistance here, from the very local, where are you going to site these projects, to the global. Who has to go first and who has to pay for it? Because right now there is a cost to a lot of these things as opposed to a net gain. So, once again, if I had the answers to like how we're going to solve the political problems here, I truly would be king of the world, and I would deserve to be king of the world, because these are, I don't want to say they're intractable, but climate change has been called a wicked hard problem, and I think that that is true.
Well, I think that that's probably a nice place to end. Betsy, it's really been lovely speaking with you about your brilliant book, and I'm glad that we got in some time for audience questions. I think they were really sharp too, and was really glad to hear you answering all of them so well. And I want to thank you guys all for coming and listening to us, and thanks again for the host for hosting. I think someone else is going to come on and say goodbye.
David, thank you. It was so great and such an honor for us to have both of you together and to listen to you. I could have listened for much more than an hour, but it's been so thought-provoking. And we're so glad that you both have books out which everyone can go and buy. Under a White Sky, which is coming out in the UK in a couple of days' time, and The Uninhabitable Earth, of course, also, which is David's book. And thank you both so much. I know it's the afternoon there, but we will be sharing the podcast, and we'll be sharing the book details after the event. And we hope that you will all come back and join us next week. We have an event about biodiversity at 5x15. But for this evening, thank you all. Thanks for your brilliant questions. We had 50 excellent questions. And we will see you all again soon. Good night. Thank you.